In a darkened room, a single screen glows with the cold light of a CT scan. The shape on it is unmistakably human, yet impossibly ancient. Threads of linen fade into vapour. Bones appear in quiet grayscale, and somewhere inside that ghostly silhouette is the trace of a hand that once cut stitched and mended. You can almost hear the soft hum of the machine as it reveals what no living witness ever saw. A skull once opened with purpose, a fracture once set with care, a small splint resting where a healer placed it 3,000 years ago. It feels unreal, like watching modern medicine reach backward through time to touch a world that shouldn't have known these things. Then the light shifts. You are no longer in the calm order of a hospital. You are standing beneath the weight of Imhotep and staring out over a sea of linen-wrapped bodies stretching farther than the night allows. 1,000,000 mummies resting shoulder to shoulder. 1,000,000 stories paused mid-sentence. The air feels thick here, as if grief itself has settled into the sand. It is impossible not to wonder who healed, who suffered, who survived long enough to be saved, and who never stood a chance. So we ask the question softly, the way one speaks in a sacred place. If Egypt once held a knowledge powerful enough to erase what happened to those who benefited from it, and those who were lost along its path. This is Serene Myths, where we do not chase definitive answers. We let the past breathe. We listen for its quiet heartbeat. And tonight we follow the whisper of a mystery that has slept beneath the sands for millennia. The desert opens slowly the way an ancient door gives way after centuries of waiting. Heat shimmers, sand shifts, and the first thing you notice is not the pyramids piercing the sky, but a softer presence moving beneath the surface. Egypt, for all its monuments of stone, was once a land shaped just as deeply by the hands of healers as by the hands that carved dynasties into rock. And when you look closely, you can feel that truth rising like warm breath from the earth. This was a place where illness was not an inconvenience to be solved, but a shadow cast by forces far beyond the body. To be sick was to fall out of harmony with the cosmos, and to heal was to coax the soul back into alignment with gods who watched every beat of a human heart. You sense immediately that this land has always held two worlds at once, and that the space between them is thin as linen wrapped around bone. If you listen longer, another figure begins to step out of the golden dust. His name has drifted through temples and across centuries. Imhotep. Architect, priest advisor, and to many the first physician whose name history bothered to remember. To the people who walked these riverbanks, he was more than human. He was the quiet mind who understood that the human body was a structure with chambers to open pathways to balance and mysteries to respect the way one respects the inner hollows of a sacred shrine. Over time, Imhotep became a god of healing, and offerings were left for him the same way prayers are whispered toward miracles today. The thought that lingers in the air is simple. If your suffering reached him, it might not reach the grave. And that hope was enough to guide entire villages toward temples that doubled as sanctuaries for the sick. Inside those temples, the air changed shape. Light from oil lamps painted warm halos over stone walls carved with hymns. The scent of resin honey and crushed herbs drifted across the floors where worshippers lay on reed mats, waiting for dreams that might reveal what their waking mind could not. Healing here was not a conversation between doctor and symptom, it was a negotiation with the divine. The priest-physicians would listen, observe, pray, chant, and prescribe in a rhythm that blended ceremony with remedy. You can almost see a woman kneeling beside a basin, her hands trembling as she surrenders her fear to a priest who traces symbols in water. You can almost hear a sick child breathing easier, an incense curls above him like a protective spell, the smell of lotus and myrrh settling into the fabric of the night. To stand in such a place feels strangely familiar, as if every hospital today still echoes its earliest blueprint from these ancient halls. But the Egyptians' blurred lines we now separate. Here healing was not a science that grew apart from myth. It was myth woven into science, inseparable and alive. When a fever rose, it was believed to be a sign of imbalance between the human spirit and forces that moved unseen through the world. And when a cure worked, it felt like grace delivered by a God's steady hand. Imagine how it must have felt to place your life in such a system where recovery came with both medicine and blessing, where remedies were prayers and prayers were remedies. Walk deeper and you realize the priests were not only guardians of ritual, they were also the keepers of medical knowledge hidden behind the stoic faces of temples. Many had memorized scrolls filled with recipes for balms, treatments for wounds, and mixtures meant to soothe pain or provoke visions. Yet these teachings were never separated from ceremony. A crushed plant was offered, with the same reverence as a sacred chant. A bandage was wrapped with intention, each motion mirroring cosmic order. The patient lay at the intersection of divine will and human wisdom, trusting that the gods and their chosen intermediaries would decide what happened next. It is here the question begins to glow around the edges. If healing was a divine act, then what did that make the healer? The Egyptian physician was not simply someone trained to patch wounds or reduce fevers. He was someone who stood close enough to the gods that ordinary people approached with both hope and trembling. He held knowledge that could soothe a dying breath back into life or send a curse unraveling through the spirit of an enemy. And in a world where medicine and magic were one such knowledge was not neutral, it shimmered with danger, it carried weight. Each word spoken, each ritual performed, each herb chosen felt like touching the fabric of creation itself. You can feel the gravity of that power when you imagine a healer walking through a village at dusk. Eyes follow him with quiet awe. Mothers clutch their children tighter. Elders bow with gratitude or caution. Every step he takes carries the memory of the gods he serves. Every gesture reminds the living that their lives are cradled between earthly frailty and celestial design. And perhaps the healer feels this too, a quiet burden pressing against his ribs. The burden of being the bridge between the mortal body and forces that stretch far beyond understanding. Yet even here in this serene landscape of faith and medicine there is a shadow. Because when the gods are believed to guide the healer's hand, mistakes cannot be simply mistakes. Unexpected deaths, unexplained sicknesses, cures that fail to work, and these are not failures of skill. They are signs that something has disturbed the harmony of the world. Illness becomes a message. Healing becomes a test. And the healer becomes both the most trusted and most feared figure in the village. As you step back to let this world settle around you, a feeling rises soft and haunting. You realize that to the Egyptians, sickness was not a private struggle. It was the universe speaking in symbols. And to walk into a temple for treatment was to walk into a conversation with the divine. You can almost feel what it must have been like to sit on the cool stone floor wrapped in linen, waiting for a priest-physician to approach. Your pulse slows, your thoughts quiet. You wait for someone who might carry your suffering upward into the realm of gods, asking them to rewrite your fate. And again the question returns. If healing required divine permission, who held more power than the healer who could summon that permission? What did it mean to hold authority not only over the body, but over the balance between life and death itself? The desert remains Serene, offering no straight answer, but perhaps that is what makes this beginning feel sacred. In Egypt, healing was not merely treatment. It was a form of storytelling, a conversation between what the body endures and what the spirit believes. And to understand this land, we must listen the way one listens to an ancient lullaby, carried on warm wind. Tonight we let that wind guide us into the deeper heart of Egypt's forgotten medicine, where each remedy hides a myth, and each myth hides a truth, too fragile to stand fully in the sun. There is a moment in every investigation where the past stops feeling distant and begins to breathe. For this journey, that moment arrives when we meet a single name carved into limestone under desert light. Teti Neb Fu. His titles spill across the wall like ripples in a sacred pool. Physician of the palace, overseer of ritual purification, keeper of the king's breath. Not once, but 3 separate times he is identified as a healer, chosen for the highest circles of power, a man permitted to stand beside royalty at their most vulnerable. And before you even step inside his tomb, you can sense that he was no ordinary practitioner. Something in the way his name lingers feels heavier, as though generations wanted us to remember him long after the secrets he carried had been swallowed by sand. When you approach the threshold, the heat rises from the stone and your breath settles into a slower rhythm. You know instinctively that this is not just the resting place of a man. It is the archive of a life woven delicately between medicine and mystery. Inside the walls begin to unfold like pages of a book written in symbols older than most nations. Rows of painted herbs stand in perfect alignment. Leaves, roots, stems all rendered with such precision that they seem ready to lift themselves from the rock. There are diagrams showing how to grind certain plants into paste, how to balance medicine until their colours shift, how to bind wounds with strips of linen soaked in oil pressed from desert blossoms. There are scenes of hands performing delicate gestures over the sick or preparing salves in bowls shaped by generations of belief. Everything feels calm, methodical, purposeful. You can almost imagine Teti Neb Fu standing beside a patient centuries ago, murmuring invocations as he works his hands, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who has mastered knowledge few could touch. But then the light hits a different section of the wall and the story changes. Where details should be, there are gouges. Where instructions once ran in an unbroken line, there are abrupt blanks, scraped down to bare stone. Some of the missing passages lie exactly where you would expect recipes for powerful remedies. Others appear beside symbols associated with venomous creatures, purification rituals, or treatments, believed to alter the balance between body and spirit. What remains intact is enough to suggest mastery. What has been removed suggests something else entirely. Standing there, you feel an ache beneath the sternum, the strange sensation of looking at a story someone wanted us to read only halfway. It is as though a hand reached across centuries not to erase the man, but to blur the map of his mind. If you press your palm against the wall, the stone is cool. It feels calm, composed, indifferent to the centuries of human fear that may have scraped it clean. But your thoughts spiral into the same question scholars have whispered for decades. Why would someone protect his memory while destroying his knowledge? Why leave his name untouched, honoured 3 times with royal acclaim, and yet silence the very details that made him worthy of such recognition? The more you look, the more it feels like an intentional divide between identity and information, as if the man was safe to venerate but the tools he wielded were not. Imagine the power he must have held. To treat a pharaoh was to touch the pivot point of an entire civilization. A healer who could save a king could change the path of years, and a healer who could end a life with equal skill could change it faster. With the authority of both medicine and ritual, Teti Neb Fu would have walked through the palace with a presence balanced between reverence and fear. His remedies might have restored strength to rulers, his knowledge of poisons might have protected them or threatened them. In a world where healing and harm were 2 sides of the same blade, the man with access to both was someone to watch closely, someone to depend on, someone to contain. You can't help imagining a late-night chamber lit by flickering lamps, a king struggling to breathe, courtiers pacing silently, and Teti Neb Fu entering with the calm of someone who understands that the next few minutes could determine the fate of a dynasty. The ointment he prepares may soothe fever or halt it entirely. A tincture might steady the heart or slow it forever. He alone would know the difference, and he alone would understand how delicate the line between devotion and danger truly was. It is possible that his knowledge became too valuable, too coveted, too risky to leave available to any future scribe. Perhaps a later generation honoured his memory, but feared what might happen if certain mixtures or rituals resurfaced in the wrong hands. The erasures on his walls do not feel like neglect, they feel like choices. They feel like the result of human hands acting with urgency or conviction. Someone stood here under the same low ceiling, scraping away parts of Teti Neb Fu's legacy, while leaving his achievements untouched. You can almost imagine the conflicted heart of the person doing it. Did they believe they were protecting society from something dangerous? Did they feel reverence while chiseling out a formula that once saved a life or ended one? Were they under royal command, a new priesthood, a fearful regime trying to wipe away the last echoes of a knowledge they could not control? A quiet hum begins beneath your ribs as you absorb the implications. Some knowledge is hidden because it is useless, some because it is sacred, and some because it is too potent to let loose. The Egyptians were masters of preservation when they wanted something to survive. Their entire civilization is a testament to their obsession with continuity. So when they erase something, the absence speaks louder than the presence. You begin to feel the gravity of that silence. It is not empty, it is heavy. It suggests that Teti Neb Fu crossed into realms of healing that threatened the balance of power, belief, or both. As you step back and let the room settle, a feeling rises, soft but insistent. It feels like standing beside a sealed door and knowing that something once lived behind it. Something that shaped lives and deaths with equal precision. Something that the future was not meant to understand. The carvings that remain show a healer. The missing ones show the boundaries of what he was allowed to leave behind. And in that tension you sense the outline of a man walking between worlds, holding knowledge that cast both light and shadow. The question lingers in the still air of his tomb, never raising its voice, but demanding to be heard. Why erase the knowledge but preserve the name? The desert outside offers only its wind brushing across the entrance like a whispered reminder that some mysteries survive not because they are revealed, but because they are protected by silence. And as you leave the chamber, Teti Neb Fu feels less like a figure of history and more like an unseen presence, guiding us deeper into the hidden corridors of Egypt's forgotten medicine. Each step carries you further from what was erased and closer to what it left behind in the dark space between truth and secrecy. The first time you see a mummified skeleton appear on a CT scan, it feels as though time itself has been peeled back with clinical precision. The image begins in grayscale silence. Bones glow with a soft translucence. Linen wraps dissolve into a haze of light. And then something unexpected reveals itself, not in the fragility of the remains, but in the unmistakable order of what was done to them. A fractured femur healed in alignment so clean it could pass for the result of modern orthopedic care. A radius set so precisely that the bone knitted back into place without the warped angles typical of untreated breaks. You can almost hear the breath you didn't realize you were holding. Because in that cold, luminous image, a pattern emerges that does not belong to chance or luck or the crude improvisations of ancient survival. It belongs to intention, to skill, to a hand that knew exactly where the body failed and how to guide it back. The feeling is unsettling in the gentlest way. You sense a kind of recognition, the recognizable trace of someone practicing medicine long before medicine had a name for itself. There is something deeply human about this realization. It suggests that in an age wrapped in myth and ritual, someone was kneeling beside a broken limb with the same careful focus that a surgeon brings into an operating room today. And as you study the long, smooth line of bone that healed straight instead of crooked, you understand that this was not the result of makeshift splinting. This required anatomical knowledge, practiced hands, and a confidence born from experience. The kind of confidence a healer gains after spending years studying how flesh tears and how bone responds to pressure, weight, and time. But the bones reveal more than healed fractures. They reveal the marks of purposeful cuts. Along the edge of a tibia or near the curve of a humerus, some mummies display incisions so clean, so deliberate that even modern radiologists pause. These are not the jagged, chaotic lines left by accidents or animal damage. They hold the unmistakable signature of controlled motion. A blade moving with certainty. A hand steady enough to open the tissue, adjust something within and close it again. To witness these lines through the sterile clarity of a CT scan is to feel as though an ancient surgeon is quietly demonstrating his work thousands of years later. There is a rhythm to the incisions, a precision that suggests a procedure rather than an injury, and in that recognition the centuries between you and the healer slip away for a moment. Yet the deeper you go, the heavier the fascination becomes, because in the same time period when much of the world treated broken bones with crude splints or simple immobilization, Egyptians were creating outcomes that resemble early surgical orthopedics. In ancient Greece, centuries later, healers like Hippocrates wrote about fractures with insight. But even those writings acknowledge the difficulty of achieving perfect realignment. In medieval Europe, broken limbs often healed poorly, leaving lifelong deformities. But here, buried under the sands of Egypt, lie individuals whose bones healed with a kind of quiet perfection. It is as if someone had already mapped the internal architecture of the human body long before such mapping was recorded. Imagine for a moment the scene in which such a skill was practiced. A dim chamber lit by flickering oil lamps. Linen laid across a low platform. A patient alive, breathing through clenched teeth, struggling against pain, as a healer rests his hands along the damaged limb. The healer would press gently, measuring angles, feeling for the shift where bone no longer meets bone. He would close his eyes, not in guesswork, but in concentration, sensing how to guide the fracture back into place. Perhaps there were assistants holding the patient steady, murmuring prayers as the healer performed motions that were both physical and sacred. Because to treat the body was never merely physical work, it was spiritual labour. To mend a bone was to restore cosmic balance, to realign the invisible harmony between flesh and fate. As you picture this ancient scene, another emotion drifts in surprise mixed with reverence. You feel it like a soft pulse at the base of the throat. The realization that people who walked this earth 4 millennia ago understood more than we imagine. The lines between superstition and science blur under your fingertips. And in that blur you see not a primitive world, but one that understood healing as both an earthly necessity and a divine calling. The surgeons of ancient Egypt may not have used stainless steel instruments or anesthesia, but their hands carried a knowledge we once believed belonged only to later ages. It becomes clear that these procedures were not isolated miracles. They were part of a tradition, a lineage of craft passed from mentor to apprentice in quiet corners of temple healing complexes, in places where walls bore inscriptions of herbs, rituals, and diagrams of limbs, in rooms where knowledge was not written for the masses, but guarded, closely whispered from one generation of healers to the next. And that secrecy may explain why so much of it feels unfamiliar to us now. Their wisdom lived more in hands than in texts. It lived in practices demonstrated, not documented. So what survives today is not their instruction manuals, but their works still visible in the bones of those they treated. Sometimes radiologists notice even stranger details. Bones set with surprising swiftness, possible use of stabilizing materials, signs that certain fractures were cleaned and aligned with unusual care before healing began. Each discovery hints at techniques lost to time, techniques that do not appear in surviving Egyptian medical papyri. The famous Edwin Smith papyrus, one of the earliest medical treatises, reveals a mind surprisingly clinical, but even it does not fully explain the precision seen in these bones. It is as if the papyrus shows us the exterior hallway of a knowledge system, while the true chambers remain sealed. Standing inside this quiet riddle, you can't help comparing ancient Egypt to other civilizations. The Indus Valley, advanced in its own ways, left little evidence of surgical intervention. Early Chinese medicine emphasized energy, pulse, and harmony more than invasive techniques. Mesopotamian healers were gifted diagnosticians but relied heavily on spells and omens. And yet here in Egypt we find the skeletal evidence of hands that not only understood anatomy but trusted themselves to cut into the body with purpose, and the feeling deepens into a kind of awe. Not loud, not dramatic, just a widening of the breath. A soft recognition that what separates us from those ancient healers is not intelligence but time. They saw the same bodies we see. They touched the same bones we touch. They faced the same urgent moment when a life depended on steady hands. And in their own way they rose to that moment with grace. When the CT scan fades to black, the emotion that lingers is quiet and strangely tender. You feel the presence of someone across the centuries, someone whose work endures not in stories but in radiographic shadows of bones they once held. A surgeon's hand unmistakably skilled, reaching through time. A reminder that even in a world of gods, rituals and myth, there were those who practiced the patient art of repair. They worked in heat in the glow of lamp flames, and the bodies they left behind carry traces of their courage, their precision, and their devotion. In the end, you realize that these ancient fractures are not just bones. They are messages, evidence of a practice far more sophisticated than myth allows. And as you step away from the scan, you feel that warm, humbling recognition once more. A surgeon was here, a real one, long before we believed such a thing was possible. When you first look at a mummified skull on a CT scan, you expect cracks from time, from pressure, from the slow collapse of centuries. What you do not expect is a doorway. A section of bone cut open with a precision so deliberate it forces the breath to stall in your throat. A circle or oval smooth along its edges, clearly shaped by a hand that knew where the bone thinned, where it curved, where it yielded. This is trepanation, but not the haphazard kind found in prehistoric remains scattered across distant continents. This is something quieter, sharper, almost surgical in intention. And then comes the part that sends a soft shiver down the spine. The bone around the opening shows signs of healing, faint but unmistakable regrowth, meaning the person lived, not minutes, not hours, but long enough for the body to respond with its ancient stubborn will to survive. You stare at the scan and an emotion rises slowly like mist, lifting from a river at dawn. Someone in ancient Egypt did this, knowing the risk, knowing the pain, knowing the delicate boundary they were crossing. They opened a skull, touched the mystery beneath, and then sealed it again. Not out of curiosity alone, because curiosity kills faster than bone can heal, but perhaps not out of mercy alone either. The silence of the CE image leaves room for questions that will never be answered. Did they attempt to relieve pressure from a head injury hoping to save a life, or did they open the skull to observe something, to learn to understand what lay inside the organ they believed housed thought, memory, or spirit? The living patient became the bridge between intention and outcome, and we can only stand here now watching that bridge fade into the grey of medical shadows. If you close your eyes, you can almost feel the room in which such a procedure might have taken place. a chamber deep within a temple complex where incense curled upward in soft spirals, and the air held the faint sweetness of heated resin. The patient may have been lying on a stone slab, rhythmic breaths stumbling into pain. The healer, perhaps a priest-physician, would have stood above him with tools crafted not for ornament but for purpose, a blade sharpened on the smooth curve of desert rock, a chisel polished from years of use, hands steadied from the weight of responsibility yet trembling at the edge of something sacred. To touch the skull was to touch the boundary between mortal and divine. To reach inside was to cross it. And in that moment the healer was both a servant of the gods and a keeper of knowledge the world could not yet name. The thought settles deeper the longer you linger. Trepanation existed in many ancient cultures, but rarely with signs of survival. Many holes were post-mortem part of ritual rather than treatment. But here in the quiet corridors beneath Egyptian sands, we find skulls that tell a different story. Edges rounded by healing, bone knitting back toward itself. The patient lived long enough for the body to acknowledge the intrusion and attempt repair. That survival makes these cases something else, evidence not only of surgical technique but of intention to preserve life, and yet another truth flickers underneath. These surgeries are not described in detail in surviving papyri. They exist not in words but in scars written on bone, as though the procedures were practiced, refined, understood, but never recorded for the world to see. And here another thought begins to bloom in the quiet. Ancient Egypt revered the head as the seat of identity, spirit, and cosmic connection. To harm it carelessly would be to invite the wrath of gods. So how do we explain the willingness to open that sacred shell? Perhaps desperation forced their hand, a head injury from a fall or a blow, a swelling so severe that the victim's eyes no longer track the world, a seizure that left the body trembling. The healer weighing the risk might have chosen action over surrender, but perhaps there was more. Perhaps in the private chambers of temple healers, curiosity and compassion intertwined in a way we may never fully understand. Maybe they sought to study consciousness or dreams or the strange behaviours that overtook the sick. For every gentle intention, a darker one might have shadowed it. For every cure attempted, an experiment might have been performed beside it. The skulls bring us another whisper of truth. Some incisions are precise and practiced. Others feel tentative, experimental, as if the healer was learning or testing boundaries. And that duality casts a long, soft ache into the air. It forces the heart to ask what the mind hesitates to consider. Were these surgeries always attempts to save, or were some meant to observe the consequences of breaching the skull at certain places? Did an ancient surgeon ever wonder what would happen if they opened slightly higher, slightly deeper, slightly closer to the place where the pulse of the mind seemed to flicker? Standing in the space between those questions, you feel a hush growing beneath your ribs. It is the hush of knowing that the patient cannot speak anymore, cannot tell us whether they were relieved or terrified, healed or harmed. Their voice has folded into the linen that wraps them. Their memory has been carried into the afterlife. And all that remains is the evidence written silently in bone. The long pause between intention and interpretation. The absence where testimony should be. You think of the centuries that followed. Of Greek physicians who would one day praise observation. Of medieval healers who would avoid opening the skull out of fear. Of modern surgeons who rely on anesthesia, sterile rooms and machines that blink warnings when blood to pressure drop. Against the backdrop of all this progress, the Egyptian skull with its healed surgical opening feels strangely intimate. A reminder that the boundary between ancient and modern is sometimes thinner than we believe. A reminder that the instinct to save a life has always existed even when wrapped in ritual and myth. And still the possibility of experimentation lingers like a shadow at the edge of the flame. Because healing and curiosity often walk side by side. And in the ancient world where knowledge was not dissected into disciplines, a healer exploring the body was also a priest exploring the nature of the soul. Every incision was both a question and an answer. Every healed edge was evidence that someone survived long enough to tell the story with their bones instead of their breath. When the CT scan finally fades and the skull rests once more in the quiet of its glass case, the feeling that remains is delicate and heavy at the same time. You sense the fragility of human life, the bravery of those ancient hands, and the impossible silence of the patient who endured. Between salvation and sacrifice, between treatment and trial, lies the soft space where history has lost its voice. And in that space the skull remains a witness, a single opening carved long ago, a single question echoing still. Did they do this to heal or to learn? And the only answer we receive is the silence of a mummy whose bones remember more than they will ever say. There is a moment when studying ancient medicine where the evidence begins to blur into something uncomfortable. A fracture healed too perfectly, a skull opened with too much confidence, a body preserved with marks that do not belong to chance. And slowly you begin to realize that behind every act of healing in Egypt there may have been another story layered beneath it, one the bones remember even when the written record refuses to speak. It is the story of two worlds sharing the same set of hands. One world belonged to kings glittering protected sacred. The other belonged to those who served them anonymous, replaceable, vulnerable. And somewhere between these worlds stood the healers caught in a delicate balance between compassion and command, between the will to save and the pressure to learn. If you imagine the medical chamber of a royal palace, you see its serenity first. Incense drifting in thin ribbons, vessel after vessel of precious oils, a healer kneeling beside a noble patient who trusts him completely. Perhaps a prince with a broken leg or a queen whose migraines return each season. For these individuals, medicine was grace. It was the full weight of knowledge directed toward preserving a lineage. Their bones, if studied today, would likely show the best outcomes. Fractures aligned, incisions precise, evidence of treatment handled with patience and care. For the wealthy, every remedy was gentle, practiced, refined. You can feel this in the air, the soft hum of ceremony surrounding medicine crafted as a shield around the elite. But another image rises just beneath the surface, darker and quieter. A chamber without incense, a slab without linens, a patient without a name. This is where knowledge grew in shadows, not for cruelty but for mastery, because in every civilization someone must learn first before they can heal the privileged. And the question that settles uneasily at the back of the mind is not whether such experiments happened, but who they happened to. Was it a servant injured in labour brought in with no family to protest? Was it a prisoner whose life was already considered forfeited? Or was it the body of someone newly dead used to practice the angle of a cut, the pressure needed to open bone, the technique required to manipulate tissue beneath the skull? You feel a heaviness beginning to build, not from accusation but from recognition. Because even in modern history, the path toward medical advancement is marked by stories we struggle to acknowledge. Secret experiments without consent, procedures tested on marginalized communities, discoveries built on the suffering of those whose names we do not know. It becomes impossible not to see echoes of this pattern stretching backward into antiquity. The idea that ancient Egyptian healers, gifted and devoted as they were, may also have walked this difficult line. A line drawn between saving the powerful and learning through the powerless. There are mummies whose bones carry the evidence of care, but not care meant for survival. Clean cuts that show training. Repetitive incisions that reveal practice. Bones opened in ways that suggest someone was testing, observing, honing a technique. And in those bones perhaps lies the quiet truth of how mastery is born. Yes, the healers saved lives, but before they could save kings, they may have learned through bodies that history never bothered to remember. Whether those bodies were alive at the time of experimentation is a question that feels almost too heavy to ask, and yet it lingers because the evidence does not offer the mercy of certainty. As you try to understand this ancient world, two images mirror each other with unsettling clarity. On one side, a royal physician bending over a wounded ruler. On the other, a novice healer practicing on a body that cannot speak. Both actions guided by the same intention to refine the craft, to deepen understanding, to prepare for the moment when a life of importance depends on perfection. Knowledge does not come free. Somewhere someone pays its cost. The emotion that rises here is not judgment but a quiet ache. A recognition that humanity has always walked this path even when dressed in different rituals. You think of 20th century experiments conducted in secrecy, patients misled or coerced truths buried beneath the promise of progress. You think of how modern medicine often looks back with regret and horror, acknowledging where it has crossed lines that should never have been crossed. And then you return to the silent bones in Egypt, bones that carry no inscriptions of suffering, no written pleas, only the shapes of cuts and healing and intrusion. Perhaps the healers themselves felt the weight of this. Perhaps they whispered a prayer each time they cut into a body that would not live to see the sun again. Or perhaps they believed that the gods had sanctioned their work, that the pursuit of knowledge was itself a sacred act. In a world where medicine and religion blended seamlessly, who could say where compassion ended and duty began? The silence surrounding these practices is not evidence of cruelty. It is evidence of a system that valued results more than records. A system where success for the elite was visible while the costs of learning disappeared into sand. If you listen closely, there is a deeper story beneath all this. A universal truth, ancient yet painfully familiar. Medicine has always carried two faces. One face is gentle, restorative, the hand that comforts the sick and saves the dying. The other face is stark, relentless, the hand that seeks understanding no matter the price. Across time, the progression from ignorance to healing has required bravery, innovation, and sacrifice. But sacrifice is not an abstract word. It belongs to specific people whose names were never carved into stone. Standing in the stillness of this thought, you feel something shift inside. A tenderness, a sorrow, a respect for the nameless bodies who may have borne the earliest steps of surgical knowledge. Their silence is not comfortable. It is not meant to be, but it is honest. And in that honesty you feel the weight of what the ancient physicians were trying to achieve. They were not simply healers. They were explorers of the human body searching for truths hidden beneath skin and bone, navigating without the tools we consider indispensable today. As the desert wind moves across your thoughts, the final realization rises gently, almost like grief. Every advancement in ancient Egypt's medicine, every perfectly healed fracture, every successful cranial procedure, every innovative treatment may have required a body that could not refuse a patient who could not speak a life considered expendable. And as harsh as that truth is, it mirrors our own history, reminding us that progress often walks hand in hand with shadow. The feeling that lingers is quiet and heavy. Knowledge in every era has a cost, and in the chambers of ancient Egypt that cost was likely paid by those whose stories were never meant to be told. If you walk deep enough into the heart of an ancient Egyptian temple, there comes a point where the air itself seems to hesitate. The walls narrow, the light softens, the sounds of the outer courtyard's chants footsteps, the rhythmic thrum of daily prayer drift into a muffled hush. And then, almost without warning, you find yourself standing in a chamber that feels impossibly balanced between two worlds. One half belongs to the divine, steeped in incense and devotion. The other half belongs to something colder, steadier, shaped by discipline rather than myth. This is the place where gods and incisions met. A room where a priest could call upon sacred forces with one hand and guide a blade with the other. The first thing you notice is the smell. It is layered, complex, strangely comforting. Burning myrrh, crushed cedar, the faint sweetness of lotus resin warming in shallow bronze bowls. These scents were believed to purify the air, to open a narrow doorway for sacred presence. But beneath them is another scent, sharp, metallic, earthy. The scent of tools sharpened on a stone, the scent of dried herbs prepared for more than prayer, the scent of bodies that once lay upon the table in the centre of the room. That table is made of limestone, smooth from years of ritual washing, but along its surface are faint marks that do not come from worship. Tiny grooves carved by repeated movements as if someone had cut fabric or flesh or bone here with unwavering intention. Imagine standing in that chamber as the oil lamps flicker. Patterns of light crawl across the walls, illuminating scenes of gods healing with the touch of a hand, or guiding mortals through suffering toward renewal. The priests recite hymns that echo upward towards ceilings painted with stars. But in the shadows between those stars you notice shelves stacked with vessels holding oils that soothe pain, powders that dull awareness, blades polished thin from years of use. You realize that this is not a contradiction. In ancient Egypt, medicine flourished under the wings of the sacred. To heal the body was to honor the divine. To cut into flesh was to correct a disharmony not only of bones and organs, but of the universe itself. A priest steps forward in your imagination, and you see how seamlessly he inhabits his many roles. His voice can calm a grieving family with a prayer. His hands can read the fever of a patient more accurately than words can describe. And when needed, those same hands can steady themselves over a wound and perform a procedure that bridges the living world with the unseen one. He is healer, intermediary, scholar, and guardian of secrets that were never meant for the uninitiated. His authority does not come from a license or degree. It comes from the belief that the gods stand behind him. And when a person believes they are guided by forces greater than themselves, they will dare to attempt what others fear. It is not difficult to imagine such a priest preparing for surgery. He would begin not by laying out tools, but by invoking protection. A whispered hymn to Sekhmet, goddess of both plague and healing. A murmur to Imhotep, architect of both pyramids and remedies. He might mark the patient's forehead with oil, not as superstition, but as a reminder that the moment ahead lies between worlds. Then he would kneel beside the patient, his breath steady, his hands confident. And that confidence alone would shape the course of what happened next. You feel an involuntary pause when you picture the actual incision. The room is warm still. The chanting outside fades into nothing. The priest lowers the blade with the same reverence he would offer in prayer. He does not use it carelessly. He uses it with purpose, not to harm, but to realign the body with cosmic order. Yet even as he works, he carries the weight of a truth we can only guess at. He knows more than he's allowed to speak. He performs more than he's allowed to record. Much of his craft lives not on papyrus, but in hands trained through quiet observation, whispered instruction and practices conducted out of sight. Here is where the chamber shifts again, revealing its shadowed intention. Behind the stone table sits a smaller alcove. In it are clay jars filled with preserved organs, bones or tissues from patients who died during treatment. These remains might be used for study for ritual or for understanding the boundaries between life and death. And in this alcove, the priest is no longer simply a healer. He is a researcher, an experimenter, a seeker of truths hidden inside the body. His work is sacred, but it is also methodical. He examines, he tests, he learns. He pushes deeper into the mysteries that the gods may or may not have intended mortals to explore. You feel a shiver then, not of fear but of realization. In this room, no modern concept of medical ethics exists. Consent is more spiritual than literal. The needs of the community outweigh the autonomy of the individual. Knowledge is pursued with determination, even if its cost is paid by the vulnerable or the voiceless. When a priest believes the gods sanction his work, hesitation dissolves. Where a modern surgeon might refuse to proceed without certainty, the ancient healer steps forward with faith as his guide. He does what he believes necessary. He does what he believes permitted. And sometimes he does what curiosity whispers. The deeper you explore this imagined space, the more its duality becomes palpable. The chants return. The incense thickens. The carved images of gods seem to glow under lamplight. But your attention is drawn again and again to the tools. The stone blades shaped for specific tasks. The bronze needles that might have sewn wounds. The scalpels that look almost modern in silhouette. These instruments shine faintly as if holding fragments of stories etched into their heads. Stories of bold attempts, stories of mistakes, stories of breakthroughs that changed the course of someone's life or ended it. Standing between the table and the altar, you feel caught in the same tension that defined the priest-physicians themselves. They were trusted and feared, honoured and restrained, elevated and isolated. Every cure they performed strengthened their myth. Every failure they endured stayed locked behind temple walls. The knowledge they gathered was not written for the public. It was contained, controlled, guarded by tradition and hierarchy. And so the chamber becomes not only a place of healing, but a vault of secrets, some noble, some dangerous, all essential to understanding who these people were. As the last lamp flickers against the stone, an emotion settles gently at the edge of the heart. It is the feeling that accompanies standing on a threshold you were never meant to cross. The awareness that the ancient healers were braver, quieter, and more complex than history often allows. They operated in a world where the sacred justified the surgical, where reverence emboldened innovation, where belief became the backbone of courage. In the silence that follows, you sense the full weight of the thought. When a healer believes the gods stand behind him, he will dare what others would never attempt. And in the dim light of that ancient chamber where prayer meets blade, you understand why so many secrets of Egyptian medicine have been lost. They were never meant to be written. They were meant to be lived in whispered rituals, in practiced cuts, in the merging of faith and flesh that only the priest-physicians could navigate. This was their laboratory, their sanctuary, their boundary between worlds. When you stand before a wall of hieroglyphs inside an ancient tomb, the first instinct is to marvel at how much has survived. Millennia of wind, sand, and shifting empires have passed, and yet the lines remain elegant, deliberate, almost breathing. But then your eyes settle on a place where the story breaks. A smooth patch of stone scraped raw, a line cut short, its meaning severed. The absence is jarring, unnatural, like a sentence torn from the middle of a whispered prayer. You run your fingertips over it and feel the unmistakable intention behind the removal. Someone wanted this gone. Someone believed the knowledge carved here was dangerous enough to erase, not carelessly but with purpose. The silence in that empty space grows heavy the longer you stay with it, until it becomes clear that the story is no longer about what was written, but about what someone feared. The first possibility rises like a dark shimmer just beneath the surface. What if the missing text described knowledge too potent for future hands, a recipe for poison used in royal intrigue, a ritual to weaken an enemy before battle, a method to manipulate fear or faith through carefully orchestrated sickness? In a society where medicine and magic intertwined, such knowledge could sway the balance of entire dynasties. A single formula might save a king one day and topple another the next. Imagine a healer who understood the subtle line between antidote and toxin, who could slip between cure and execution with nothing more than a shift in dosage. That kind of power does not sit comfortably with those who seek control. Maybe a later ruler stood here, ordered the erasure, and walked away believing they had sealed a danger forever inside the stone. A second possibility unfurls more quietly but no less haunting. Political tides in Egypt changed often, with new dynasties rewriting not only laws but cosmologies. What one era considered sacred, the next might condemn as heresy. A ritual once seen as a gift from the gods could become taboo under the rule of a rival priesthood. A technique praised as innovation might later be framed as sacrilege. So perhaps the erasure was not fear of the knowledge itself, but fear of its origins. A king eager to distance his reign from the practices of his predecessors might order the cleansing of texts associated with a disfavored cult or temple. It is not difficult to imagine temple scribes moving through corridors at night, lanterns, flickering chisels in hand, carving away the past line by line, not out of malice but survival. In Egypt, alignment with the wrong form of knowledge could cost a life. Better to scrape the wall clean than leave it speaking an inconvenient truth. But the third possibility is the one that lingers the longest, settling into the mind with a slow, cold ache. What if the knowledge was erased not because it was powerful and not because it was forbidden, but because it had failed catastrophically? Imagine a procedure designed to heal but performed on someone of immense importance. A royal child, a beloved queen, a general whose strength was needed for a crucial campaign. The healer, confident and skilled, made an incision meant to relieve suffering. But something went wrong, something went terribly, irrevocably wrong. Perhaps the patient died in a way that sparked panic or outrage or political opportunity. A single disastrous moment could reshape the perception of an entire tradition. And in the aftermath, those in power might decide that the safest way to move forward was to bury the knowledge altogether, erase it, pretend it never existed. Not because it lacked value, but because the memory of its failure threatened the fragile order of the kingdom. You begin to understand the weight of this silence. Each scrape on the wall is not random destruction. It is an act of fear, a decision made by people who believed they were protecting their world from something that resisted control. The feeling that rises is not anger, but a solemn kind of empathy. It is easy to imagine the scribe who stood here with a chisel, the conflict in his chest, knowing he was extinguishing knowledge that once shaped lives, knowing he was obeying the demands of rulers or gods or circumstances that left little room for moral debate. The wall did not lose its words by accident. It lost them because someone at some point in history felt threatened by what they meant. And this realization widens into something timeless. Knowledge, especially medical knowledge, has always carried a shadow. In every era, there are ideas considered too complex, too volatile, too dangerous to release freely. Even in modern times, breakthroughs in genetics, virology, and pharmacology are sometimes shrouded in secrecy until the world decides how to handle their consequences. Laboratories hide work behind locked doors. Governments classify research that touches too close to vulnerability. And humanity walks the same delicate edge the Egyptians once walked. We crave progress, but we fear the chaos it might unleash. So when you return to the erased wall, you no longer see emptiness. You see a boundary, a warning, a reminder that knowledge lives only as freely as society allows. The Egyptians understood this deeply. They carved their wisdom into stone, but they also carved it out again when necessary. They preserved the memory of healers like Teti Neb Fu while bearing the specifics of their craft. They honoured the man, but removed the map to his methods. Because a name is harmless, a formula is not. The emotion that settles at the end of this reflection is quiet, nearly tender. A sorrow for what was lost, and a recognition of why it may have needed to be lost. You feel the presence of generations who danced between discovery and danger, who shaped their world, carefully aware of how easily a single idea could unmake it. And the truth rises soft and steady like breath in the stillness. An entire world of knowledge can vanish the moment it makes someone or some era feel unsafe. And somewhere beneath the sand of Egypt, the echo of that fear continues to sleep close as a heartbeat, waiting for us to wonder what was erased and why it mattered so much. There is a moment after wandering through the quiet depth of Egypt's medical chambers when the mind must step back and consider a truth that does not fit easily inside the gentle glow of oil lamps. For hours you have walked through rooms where healers bent every fragment of knowledge towards saving a single precious life. You have imagined the soft prayers, the careful hands, the rituals woven with devotion and urgency. These were places built to protect the elite, where the body of a king or a royal child was cradled as though the cosmos itself depended on their survival. But as you step out of that sanctum, the air changes, the light changes, and suddenly the gentleness of the temple fades into something harsher. You feel it before you see it, a pressure in your chest, a weight rising beneath the sand. Then the landscape opens and everything inside you goes still. Before you lies a field of the dead. Not 20 bodies, not 100, but thousands, hundreds of thousands. Eventually the staggering truth arises. 1,000,000. 1,000,000 mummies wrapped and buried layer upon layer, an ocean of silent remains, stretching beyond the reach of a single glance. They do not belong to royalty. They do not belong to names carved into stone. They are the forgotten, the ordinary, the unprotected. And their presence stands in stark contrast to the world you just left behind. In one place, knowledge flooded toward a single body. In this place, knowledge seems to have failed entirely. The wind grazes the surface of the sand, lifting grains that whisper against each other like distant voices. You look closer and the scene becomes even more haunting. Small bodies, large bodies, entire families, the cloth around them worn thin by time but still shaped in familiar contours. There is an uncomfortable intimacy in seeing so many human forms gathered in one place, a reminder that these were not statistics. They were lives with laughter, arguments, hopes, aches, and yet here they rest indistinguishable from one another, melted into a single collective memory the world almost forgot. Your mind shifts back to the scene inside the temple, the surgeon priest kneeling beside a patient of importance, the careful alignment of bone, the perfectly executed incision, the meticulous steps designed to bring life back into a fragile body, and then you look out at the expanse before you where bodies lie untouched by that same precision. No evidence of surgeries, no healed fractures, no interventions marked by expertise. It feels like stepping from light into darkness, as if you have walked directly into the blind spot of the civilization you were beginning to admire. A question rises softly at first, then grows heavy enough to settle into your ribs. If ancient Egypt possessed such sophisticated healing knowledge, why does this place exist? Why are there so many dead packed into the earth without ceremony, without attempt, without the care afforded to a single royal limb? The feeling that follows is not anger, it is not judgment, it is grief. A quiet, sinking grief that comes from realizing that medicine, no matter how advanced, has always served those with power first. Royalty could summon the finest healers in the kingdom. The wealthy could purchase remedies made with precious herbs. But the poor, the labourers, the displaced, they walked into sickness with nothing but hope. They died in waves that left no room for rituals, no room for stories, no room even for proper wrapping. And the healers who saved kings could do nothing for them. Or perhaps were never sent to try. You take another step, feeling the sand shift beneath your feet. The contrast sharpens. In the palace, a healer's hands moved like instruments of divine intervention. Here hands moved quickly, repetitively, burdened by sheer scale, wrapping bodies, layering them, trying desperately to keep up with a tide of death that no ritual could stem. This was not the world of measured remedies. It was the world of triage without hope. A world where the best a community could do was protect the dead from scavengers and time, because they could not protect the living from whatever had taken them. And something else begins to whisper inside your mind. A darker possibility, one that adds an ache to the breath. Perhaps the healers did know. Perhaps they did try. Perhaps some catastrophe struck with such force. Disease, famine, contamination. A collapse of resources that even the most sophisticated medicine became powerless. What if this sea of bodies is not evidence of neglect, but evidence of defeat? A moment in Egyptian history too overwhelming to record, too devastating to explain, too dangerous to preserve in memory. Every civilization has moments it chooses to forget. Moments when power reveals its limits and gods grow quiet. You find yourself standing between two worlds again. The world of the palace, where every gesture was purposeful, where the fragility of one life justified entire systems of knowledge, and the world of the necropolis, where fragility swelled into a force larger than human ability. These shadows touching both ends of Egyptian society reveal a truth both tender and terrible. Medicine, no matter how exalted, cannot stop everything. Healing, no matter how sacred, is still at the mercy of forces larger than any temple could contain. But another thought rises too, carried gently on the dry breeze. What if these two worlds shaped each other? What if the desperation born in the presence of mass death compelled healers to refine their techniques for those in power? What if the failures here gave birth to the breakthroughs there? What if the countless unnamed dead became the silent foundation upon which royal medicine stood? It is an uncomfortable thought, but a necessary one. Medicine often grows not only in sanctuaries, but in crises. Not only in triumphs, but in tragedies. And when 1 million people lie beneath the sand, their stillness becomes a question we cannot escape. If Egyptian medical knowledge was strong, why did so many die? And if Egyptian medical knowledge was limited, why were the elite spared while others faded quietly into earth? The wind continues to whisper over the dunes, and the only answer is a feeling that settles deep and low. Between the sacred art of healing and the harsh reality of mass death lies a truth older than any civilization. Privilege shapes survival, and even the greatest healers cannot hold back a tide when the tide is meant to rise. When you first hear the phrase "a cemetery of 1 million mummies," it sounds impossible, almost exaggerated, like something whispered in a myth rather than recorded by archaeology. But when you stand at the edge of that place, when you see the low cliffs, the narrow shafts, the dry earth, cracked from centuries of sun, something inside your chest tightens as you understand that the number is not a metaphor. It is a reality carved into the desert itself. 1 million bodies, 1 million lives. Not kings, not nobles. Just ordinary people laid down in layers so vast that the boundary between one person and the next dissolves into something almost geological. This was not a resting place built to celebrate individuals. This was a system, a mechanism, an answer to death on a scale too overwhelming for ritual alone. As you descend through the first passage, the air changes. It becomes still dense and strangely warm, as if the breath of thousands still lingers in the stone. The walls begin to feel closer, as though they were never meant to hold so many remains. The shafts slope downward into the chambers that seem to repeat themselves, each one identical, each one crowded. And as the lamplight flickers across the scene, the truth reveals itself in shadows. Body wrapped beside body, feet aligned against feet, linen worn thin to the texture of pressed dust. What you feel is not fear. It is a suffocating sense of scale. This is not a place designed for mourning. It is a place designed for volume, a place where death arrived not as tragedy but as a tide. Your eyes adjust, and slowly the differences between these mummies and the regal ones you've seen in museums become painfully obvious. These bodies were not prepared with the care given to pharaohs. No jeweled amulets, no intricate wrappings, no preserved organs placed in delicate jars. The technique is simpler, faster, more utilitarian. It has the feeling of a process rather than a ceremony. Bodies dehydrated with natural salts, wrappings minimal and repetitive, faces covered just enough to protect, not enough to honour. The people who performed this work were not artisans crafting a spiritual journey. They were labourers managing a crisis. And that understanding reshapes everything around you. Suddenly the chambers do not feel like a necropolis. They feel like an assembly line of endings, a place where grief had to be set aside in service of efficiency. You imagine workers moving through the space with haste, carrying bodies from carts, laying them down, wrapping, sealing, returning for more. Each action becomes routine because routine is the only way to survive the unthinkable. There is an eerie rhythm in your mind now, a rhythm of movement and necessity, echoing faintly through the centuries. You pause to steady yourself because the emotional weight of the place begins to press down. In this room, individuality disappears. These were lives, but here they become numbers, units, quantities. Each body once held memories, laughter, mistakes, desires. Yet here all those stories collapse into a single overwhelming narrative of loss. You can sense the sorrow of it, not loud or dramatic, but deep, slow, penetrating. The kind of sorrow that settles under the ribs and refuses to leave. A step deeper and you notice how the chambers narrow again, as if the earth itself grew exhausted trying to contain so much death. The ceiling dips low enough that you straighten your posture instinctively. You feel the heat of your own breath bouncing back from the stone. Every inhale is thick with the memory of time. You realize that this place was not built to be visited. It was built as a necessity, a silent solution to a crisis too large to comprehend. The stories of these people were never meant to be told individually. The sheer number of dead made that impossible. You look closer at one of the bodies near your feet. The wrappings are fragile, but the outline of the skeleton remains visible. Long limbs, short limbs, small frames of children. The shapes blend together until you can no longer distinguish the old from the young. It becomes painfully clear whatever caused this mass burial did not discriminate. It took the strong and the weak, the wealthy and the poor, the hopeful and the weary. And the people who buried them could only do what human beings have always done in the face of catastrophe. They kept going. As you continue through the passage, an unsettling emotion begins to stew beneath your calm. It is the anxiety that comes from knowing something happened here that Egypt chose not to record. Something so immense that it forced the creation of a burial system, unlike anything else in the land of pyramids. Something so destructive that rituals had to be simplified, identities had to be forgotten, and burial became an act of logistics rather than remembrance. Each chamber you pass reinforces the same feeling. This is not a traditional cemetery. This is not a sacred garden of the afterlife. This is a mass response to crisis. Perhaps disease. Perhaps famine. Perhaps the slow-grinding collapse of a community caught between droughts and failing systems. Whatever it was, it left behind a footprint too large to ignore and too painful to preserve in official records. The tragedy of it becomes tangible as you realize how alone these people were in death. No inscriptions mark their names. No symbols explain their fate. Their stories dissolved into sand the moment the last worker sealed the chamber. The only trace they left is the overwhelming quantity of their presence. And in that quantity, something primal stirs inside you. A recognition of how fragile human life becomes when society fractures. A fear that echoes forward into our own time. A reminder that history often records kings but forgets the crowds who suffered beneath them. You stand still for a long moment, letting the weight of the place settle into your bones. The silence feels complete, as though the air itself holds its breath in respect for the millions who have none left to give. You realize that this is not a place for storytelling. It is a place that consumes stories. A place where identity evaporates into statistics. Where death is no longer measured by individual grief but by volume. This is not where personal narratives live. This is where death is counted in batches, in stacks, in layers, in lots. And as you turn back toward the passage that will lead you out, the final feeling rises through you like a slow aching tide. This cemetery does not teach us about a single life. It teaches us about the moment a civilization was overwhelmed. It is not a story of individuals, it is a story of scale. And the scale is almost beyond what the human heart can ne'er bear. At first glance, a cemetery of 1 million mummies feels like a paradox carved into the desert. It is too large to comprehend, too silent to ignore, and too uniform to make sense as ordinary mortality. But as you step deeper into the chambers and the soft dust rises in slow spirals beneath your feet, something begins to shift in your understanding. Layer after layer of bodies stacked without hierarchy, without distinction, without the careful separations that normally mark centuries of burials, suggests not the slow march of time, but the rapid collapse of it. You begin to notice the patterns the earth is quietly holding. Bodies of all ages intermingled, children wrapped beside elders, women alongside men, skeletons showing no signs of struggle or wound. Entire chambers filled seemingly all at once, the layers compressed into a tight sequence of death that arrived too quickly for ritual to keep pace. And in that pattern, a possibility begins to rise soft and ominous like a question shaped from dust. What if this was a plague? What if this place now resting in silence beneath the Egyptian sun was once the desperate answer to a catastrophe that swept through cities and villages with a speed no healer could outrun? You can almost feel that possibility pressed into the soil. The density of bodies, the lack of separation by social class, the absence of elaborate rites. All of it mirrors the signatures left behind by pandemics throughout human history. When death becomes relentless, burial shifts from ceremony to necessity. Graves widen, rituals simplify. Entire communities reshape themselves around the urgency of survival. And standing here surrounded by the dead, you feel how easily the same transformation could have taken place thousands of years ago along the Nile. Your thoughts wander to the most famous plague in Western memory, the Black Death of medieval Europe. Historians still speak of the way bodies were carried by cart through narrow streets, of how mass pits were dug in haste, how entire families vanished within days of each other. In those graves, just as in this one, the bones of infants lie beside adults. The wealthy and the impoverished are buried together. The soil compresses layers of death from a short catastrophic window of time. Pandemics do not discriminate. They do not pause to honour hierarchy. They move like wildfire, consuming breath and order alike. And now, as you look around this Egyptian necropolis, the parallels feel too striking to ignore. If a plague did sweep through this region, what might it have looked like? You imagine the crowded markets of an ancient town, voices rising in lively barter, unaware that an unseen force was already threading itself from person to person. Perhaps the first signs were dismissed: a fever here, a cough there, a child growing weak in the night. But then the pattern would have sharpened, entire households falling ill at once, villages losing their elders in tragic succession, lines of workers carrying bodies toward the desert, each trip heavier than the last. And as fear spread faster than the sickness, the people would have turned to their priests, their healers, their gods. They would have begged for intervention, for understanding, for mercy. But what happens when mercy does not arrive? A quiet, painful answer surrounds you in the stillness of this chamber. The healers were overwhelmed. Even the priest-physicians, once confident in their rituals and remedies, would have stood at the edge of helplessness as the sickness leapt from patient to patient. Their chants, their poultices, their invocations might have offered comfort but not cure. Faced with a calamity beyond their comprehension, they did what humans always do in the face of mass death. They adapted. They simplified the acts of burial. They created a system that could scale with the rising tide of bodies. They built a cemetery large enough to swallow a catastrophe. Your breath grows slower as you let that possibility settle. If this was a plague, it must have surged through more than one village to produce the numbers buried here. Entire districts, clusters of towns, perhaps even thriving ports along the Nile. Ships carrying grain goods, and unbeknownst to them, disease. The idea that such an event could vanish from written history feels strange but not impossible. Not every dynasty wanted to carve its failures into stone. Some rulers preferred silence over shame. And plague, more than almost any disaster, was seen as a disruption of cosmic balance, a sign that divine protection had faltered. What ruler would willingly preserve a record of that? You turn this thought over gently, the way one turns a fragile artifact in the palm. If a pandemic did occur, it might have left traces not in hieroglyphs but in stories whispered across generations, folk tales of sudden sickness, myths of nights when entire homes went quiet, legends of gods angered or spirits wandering. Egypt is a land of mythological richness where tales often conceal truths too painful for direct telling. It is not hard to imagine that somewhere tucked inside an old tale of desert storms or divine wrath lies a faint echo of what happened here. And the silence of the bodies begins to feel heavier. Not just because they died, but because they died together, in numbers, in proximity, without privilege to protect them. The priests may have laboured to keep the burial process respectful, but the scale overwhelmed every intention. Standing in this chamber, you understand the delicate balance between reverence and necessity. The people here were not unloved. They were simply too many, too fast, too sudden for the living to mourn one by one. A soft sadness unfurls inside your chest. It is the sadness that comes from recognizing the limits of human control. Egypt's healers were brilliant, intuitive, courageous. They aligned bones, opened skulls, and performed procedures centuries ahead of their time. And yet if this cemetery marks the aftermath of plague, it also marks the moment their knowledge met a force greater than any one hand could mend. But another layer of emotion rises too, a quiet awe at the resilience of the people who survived long enough to bury the dead. Their labour carved entire chambers from the earth. Their grief wrapped countless bodies in linen. Their endurance kept their communities from collapsing entirely. Even in disaster, humanity finds a way to keep moving. You step back from the mummies and try to imagine the world above this chamber thousands of years ago. The frantic scramble of life, the hurried whispers, the sudden emptiness of streets. And then the slow aching return to normalcy as survivors rebuilt their lives without ever writing down the nightmare that had passed through them. The question returns now a soft echo beneath the heartbeat of the desert. If this was a plague which cities did it swallow, did it begin in a marketplace, a port, a farm near the Nile? And does it live on even now, hidden in some half-remembered legend distorted by time into myth? The chamber offers no answer, only the silence of the dead, only the memory of a crisis too vast to preserve in ink. And as you ascend toward daylight, the last feeling remains with you like a quiet shadow. If this place holds the remnants of a plague, then you are walking through the footprint of a catastrophe the world forgot. A catastrophe so large it could only be buried, not recorded. When you stand in the silence of the million mummy cemetery long enough, the mind begins to seek explanations beyond plague. It is a natural instinct, almost protective, to widen the lens and consider that catastrophe might come in forms quieter than disease. Some tragedies do not burn through a population with fever and delirium. Some tragedies starve people slowly or break them under the weight of labour or sweep them into the shadows of political violence. And as you study the bodies around you, their smallness, their sameness, their sheer number, a new question begins to take shape. What if this was not a sickness at all? What if the cause of death here was not microscopic but systemic? What if the force that filled these chambers was human? The first possibility rises like a dry wind across the mind's horizon. Famine. Egypt was the gift of the Nile, but it was also vulnerable to its mood. A river that nourished life could in years of weak flooding withhold its generosity. Crops would fail. Stored grain would vanish. Children would weaken first, their ribs growing sharp beneath thinning skin. Elders would follow. Entire families would find themselves caught between the sky's indifference and the soil's barrenness. And when famine tightens its grip, death arrives not with drama but with a slow, devastating stillness. The bodies found here reflect that possibility, their bones showing signs of malnutrition, their frames small, fragile, unfinished. You imagine a mother carrying her child to this burial ground, whispering apologies into the wrappings. You imagine labourers too weak to lift tools collapsing beside the fields they once tended. Hunger is a weapon no one can negotiate with. It leaves no survivors by strength alone, but another possibility steps in darker and more deliberate. Political or religious purges have stained every era of human history. A shift in dynastic power, a conflict between priesthoods, a ruler threatened by dissent. In such times, entire groups can vanish not because nature turned against them, but because authority did. You imagine soldiers moving through a village at dawn, rounding up those who followed the wrong god or supported the wrong lineage. You imagine rows of prisoners forced to march into the desert, their fate already sealed before the sun reached its height. The bodies in this cemetery may hold no signs of violent trauma, but political purges do not always require bloodshed. Some rely on abandonment, on starvation, on slow neglect disguised as punishment, and mass death when tied to fear rarely finds its way into official history. Yet a third scenario rises too, one shaped not by hatred or famine, but by labour. Egypt's colossal monuments did not rise gently from the earth. They were carved through the bodies of thousands, tens of thousands, workers who toiled under scorching sun, hauling stones, digging canals, shaping temples into immortality. Though recent research suggests many labourers were skilled craftsmen rather than slaves, the burden placed upon them was immense. Injuries, infections, exhaustion, any of these could become fatal in an age with limited resources for the ordinary worker. And if a major construction project strained the workforce beyond its limits, the result could be wave after wave of unrecorded deaths. Not the dramatic deaths of warriors, not the ceremonial deaths of royalty, but quiet deaths. Bodies wrapped quickly and stacked in haste so the work could continue. You can almost see them bent over their tools one day, carried into the desert the next. As these scenarios unfold in your imagination, an emotion rises slowly from beneath the surface. It is not fear. It is not shock. It is a deep, weary ache, a recognition that tragedy does not always announce itself with fever or flame. Sometimes it settles invisibly over a community shaped by policies, by hunger, by the grinding pressure of survival. Sometimes the cause of death is not a virus, but a system, a structure, a choice made by people far from those who suffer its consequences. You look again at the small bodies, the elderly, bodies the women carefully wrapped beside infants. They were not soldiers, they were not criminals, they were not enemies of the state, they were simply victims of circumstances too vast to fight. And the thought that presses into your chest is painfully modern. Death does not need a pathogen. It needs indifference, needs neglect, needs a world where certain lives matter less than others. And in that sense, the Million Mummy Cemetery is not unique to its time. It is a mirror. A reflection of how easily human societies can shift from protection to exploitation, from care to abandonment. You let this realization settle slowly like dust in a quiet room. Perhaps famine carved these chambers, perhaps political cleansing, perhaps labour, perhaps a combination of all three layered across decades until the cemetery became the final ledger of suffering. Whatever the cause, the overwhelming truth remains the same. These deaths did not happen one by one in peaceful homes. They came in waves. They came with urgency. They came in numbers that reshaped the landscape. And the silence in which they now rest does not erase the magnitude of their story. If anything, it amplifies it. These chambers remind you that civilizations are not only built by those who rule them, but by those who endure their darkest hours. The unnamed workers, the forgotten victims, the countless lives that never reached the walls of a temple or the pages of a scroll. Standing here surrounded by a million quiet witnesses, the final feeling rises with a slow, sorrowful clarity. Sometimes death does not require a plague. Sometimes it requires only a system that stops seeing people as people. And in that truth, the air becomes heavy and the silence becomes a warning whispered across time. When you look out over the vast landscape of the Million Mummy Cemetery, one realization hits harder than any other. For a tragedy of this magnitude, an event so enormous it reshaped the soil itself, you would expect the echoes of it to appear in Egypt's written memory. A warning carved into stone, a lament etched in ink, a record, a decree, a prayer, anything to mark the moment when death arrived in quantities too overwhelming for ritual or reason. And yet the official texts are almost entirely silent. No mention of the mass graves, no accounts of a famine that swallowed whole districts, no hymns mourning in a plague. The scrolls speak of kings, conquests, harvests, offerings. They speak of eternity, of cosmic order, of divine protection, but they do not speak of this. The silence is not accidental. You feel that in your bones the moment you try to imagine a scribe's hand hovering above a fresh piece of papyrus. To write such a story, to confess that a ruler failed, that a god's protection faltered, that a kingdom staggered under the weight of its dead would have been to crack the very foundation of Egyptian worldview. History in their eyes was not a neutral recounting of events. It was an extension of cosmic order, a tapestry meant to show the world as it should be, not always as it was. And so the darker truths slipped quietly beneath the sand, stored not in ink, but in bodies. You begin to understand why a ruler would avoid acknowledging catastrophe. Pharaohs were not just leaders, they were the axis between heaven and earth, the intermediaries ensuring stability, fertility, harmony. Their legitimacy rested on the idea that the gods walked with them, that their reign reflected divine favour. To admit a calamity of this scale would be to admit that the cosmic order had been fractured on their watch, that crops failed because they could not intercede, that death spread because the gods turned away. A single line of text describing mass death would undermine 1,000 lines proclaiming divine harmony. Kings protect power not only with armies but with narratives. And then there is the second force shaping this silence, faith itself. Imagine being a priest standing in a temple filled with incense, telling worshippers that the gods shield them, that sickness is rare, that prosperity is proof of devotion. Now imagine the same priest facing a reality he cannot explain: children dying in numbers he has never seen, elderly collapsing in marketplaces, families disappearing overnight. Would he carve that truth into the walls, or would he hide it to preserve belief? When a society depends on faith for stability, there are certain truths too heavy to reveal, and you feel the weight of that decision in the stillness of these chambers. The more you reflect on this silence, the more you recognize its shape. History is not an honest stream. It is curated, sculpted, edited by those who stand to lose the most from transparency. Every civilization has chapters it refuses to write. Rome covered up defeats. Medieval kingdoms erased humiliations, modern nations bury scandals in classified archives, and Egypt, a land where rulers were gods and gods were perfect, could not afford the stain of a tragedy too large to frame as divine will, so they sealed the story beneath the earth, not in malice but in fear. Fear of chaos, fear of doubt, fear that a population already shaken by loss would unravel if told their gods had faltered. You look again at the bodies, at the layers of linen and time, and a quiet sadness rises. These people died twice, once in flesh and once in memory. Their stories were stolen not by forgetfulness but by intention. They were erased not because they were insignificant but because they were too significant, too disruptive to the illusion of eternal order. The sand remembers what the scribes refused to write. The earth carries the chapters the temples did not carve. The thought curls around your chest and tightens softly. You begin to wonder how many tragedies across human history have been buried the same way. How many unrecorded disasters lie beneath fields, beneath rivers, beneath modern cities? How many communities vanished without a name because rulers could not bear the stain of their loss? History, when stripped of inscriptions and monuments, often reveals itself as a shadow play. Not the truth, but the version of truth that kept power intact. And yet, standing here in the hush of this ancient necropolis, the dead insist on being remembered. Not individually, there are too many for that, but collectively. Their silence is not empty. It is a testimony, a reminder that the world we inherit is shaped as much by what was hidden as by what was celebrated. And as you stand at the edge of this buried catastrophe, you feel a strange mixture of sorrow and clarity, because you finally understand history is not simply what happened. History is what someone chose to write down. And here, in this chamber of a million lost voices, you feel the truth as strongly as the desert wind brushing your skin. The darkest chapters of a civilization are not always forgotten. Sometimes they are erased by the hands of those who feared them. There is a moment as you stand within the vast chambers of the million-mummy necropolis, when a second realization creeps in beneath the first. At first, this place feels like the residue of catastrophe, a graveyard born of famine, plague, or collapse. But then you look closer at how the bodies are arranged, how they were prepared, how they were wrapped with haste yet with method. And a quiet, unsettling thought begins to rise. What if this place was not only a cemetery? What if it was also something else, a resource, a repository? A silent archive of human bodies that the priest-physicians could access when the living grew too few, too fragile, or too valuable to experiment on. The idea does not appear loudly. It arrives softly, like the cold tip of a finger brushing the back of your neck. In Egypt, where healing and ritual were fused, the dead were not simply mourned. They were tools of understanding. Bodies told stories about disease, injury, age, childbirth, violence, stories not written in symbols but in bone and tissue. And here in this one place, the sheer number of bodies offered more stories than any temple scribe could ever capture. You imagine a young apprentice following a master healer into one of these chambers, their oil lamps casting faint halos against linen-wrapped forms. The master pauses, gestures to a body and begins a lesson. The heart rests here, the lungs collapse like this, illness warps the spine like that. The apprentice listens wide-eyed, not realizing that this moment, this quiet violation will one day guide a healing ritual performed on someone powerful. The thought pulls at you in contradictory directions, part revulsion, part understanding. It is strange how easily practical necessity can overwrite reverence. Egypt treated the dead with extraordinary care, when ancestry, wealth and rank demanded it. But what of ordinary people? What of victims of disaster? What of bodies that filled chambers faster than priests could write eulogies? Or, in times of stability, every death belonged to a story. But in times of crisis, every death belonged to a system, and systems do not grieve. Now imagine a priest-physician entering this necropolis after a period of overwhelming mortality. His hands are steady, his gaze calm. He is not here out of cruelty, he is here out of duty. The living need healers who understand what the dead can no longer teach with breath. He kneels beside a body that once held dreams and fears and warmth. He unwraps the cloth, he studies the chest cavity, tracing the path of disease, the mark of starvation, the residues of fever. Knowledge expands, but at a cost. In this moment, the body is no longer a person, it is a case study. That realization feels like a stone dropped into the stomach. You see the dark symmetry of it. A person dies from suffering the kingdom could not prevent. and then in death they become a lesson that might prevent someone else's suffering. A cruel kindness, a merciful exploitation, a contradiction so deeply human it hurts to name. In the chambers of healing, the priest-physicians sought to preserve life. In the chambers of the dead, they learned how life slips away. You picture a healer observing the signs of malnutrition etched into ribs, the remnants of lung disease clinging to the hollowed chest, the strange bending of bone caused by chronic deprivation. For him, these details are bupor, insights, a roadmap to understanding what kills the poor faster than the powerful. His observations will help him save a noble child in the palace, a general fallen from his chariot, a queen weakened by childbirth, but the body he studies receives no such salvation. It has already paid its debt. And here the emotion swells into something heavy and tragic. From the perspective of knowledge, this place is priceless. From the perspective of humanity, it is unbearable. A body that suffered in life becomes raw material in death. A life that ended too soon extends value only after breath has ceased. A catastrophe that took thousands becomes an open-air library for healers who faced limits too painful to accept. The desert does not judge this. The stone chambers do not protest, but your heart does. It senses the imbalance, the quiet violation, the strange intimacy between reverence and practicality. You think back to the royal surgical chambers, the incense, the chants, the careful cleansing of tools, the desperate prayers over a single arm, a single fracture, a single skull. How much was learned there? How much was practiced here? How many of the techniques used to save kings were refined on the nameless dead? The contrast sharpens until it becomes impossible to ignore. A king's life was priceless, a worker's body was abundant, and in the cruel arithmetic of ancient medicine, abundance became opportunity. Your breath tightens slightly as you imagine the final step of this cycle. The priest-physician leaving the necropolis after a night of study. He returns to the temple, washes his hands in sacred oils, recites a purification hymn. The next day he performs a procedure on someone of stature with newfound confidence. And somewhere in the necropolis, the body that taught him rests in the dark, unacknowledged, unmourned, its contribution to healing hidden behind centuries of sand. What does it mean to advance knowledge this way? Is it wrong? Is it necessary? The mind hesitates to judge because the world of the past did not see autonomy as we do, but the heart feels the impact deeply. The dead did not consent to become lessons. Their suffering did not ask to be analysed. Their bodies did not ask to become chapters in a curriculum, and yet they did. Quietly, unwillingly, indefensibly. What remains in the end is the soft, aching paradox. Without these bodies, people's ancient medicine might not have grown. Without their tragedies, future tragedies might have multiplied. Their deaths shaped the healers who shaped the kingdom. But that does not erase the cruelty woven into the necessity. From the perspective of a knowledge, these bodies were data. From the perspective of humanity, they were stories never finished. And as you walk upward toward daylight, leaving this silent archive behind, the feeling settles deep in a mixture of sorrow, gratitude, and discomfort. This place teaches us one truth with sharp clarity. Sometimes progress grows not from triumph but from layered tragedy. Sometimes healing is built on the backs of the lost. And in Egypt's darkest chambers, the dead became the curriculum no one dared to write down. There is a particular stillness that settles over you the moment you notice the smaller shapes among the rows of bodies. Until now, the necropolis has felt overwhelming in its scale, an ocean of linen, bone and dust. But when your eyes adjust and begin to separate the forms, a softer, more fragile truth rises out of the haze. Children, infants, tiny limbs curled in positions that echo sleep more than death. Some wrapped carefully as though by a parent's trembling hands. Others wrapped hastily, the cloth loose around their faces, the corners tucked in with the tired urgency of a ritual performed too many times in too little time. And suddenly the weight of this place shifts from tragedy to heartbreak. You kneel closer, letting the lamplight fall gently across one of the tiny forms. The wrappings cling to the shape of a small body barely long enough to have taken its first steps. The skull beneath the linen is delicate, the bones thin, untested by life's demands. You notice the position of the arms drawn close to the chest as if the child was laid down with tenderness even in haste. Some children were buried with amulets, crude charms shaped by hands that hoped for protection even in the face of devastation. A few hold remnants of small reed dolls or beads are tokens that once brought joy in rooms now long forgotten. The details are almost unbearable in their simplicity. These were lives just beginning, caught in a calamity too large to understand. You breathe slowly, taking in the stillness, trying to honour the silence rather than break it. But the questions come anyway, quiet and heavy. What happened to these children? Did they fall to sickness that spread faster among the young? Did starvation claim them? First, as it often does in times of famine, were they victims of exhaustion of labour, of harsh conditions? Or an even more difficult question, were they ever treated by the priest-physicians in their final hours? Did someone try to save them with mixtures meant for adults? Did rituals meant to invoke protection fall short? The bones offer no clear answers, the linen wraps hold no confession, and yet the emotional truth of their presence speaks louder than any inscription could. You move deeper into the chamber and the numbers grow. Children of all ages, newborns barely wrapped, toddlers with fragile ribs that seem to shrink under the lamplight. Older children, their limbs longer, their bones showing signs of labour, hardship, malnutrition. For some, the skulls carry faint evidence of healed injuries, small fractures that suggest falls or accidents, the ordinary wounds of childhood. Others show signs of illness written into their ribs and vertebrae. Perhaps some were already sick when the larger catastrophe struck. Perhaps that they never had a chance. A thought forms at the edge of the mind, gentle but haunting. Could some of these children have been part of the experiments or observations carried out by healers, not maliciously but desperately? A healer standing over a sick childhood, unable to stop the fever, trying a new mixture, adjusting a ritual, hoping that this time the gods might intervene. You can imagine the priest-physician whispering prayers over a child's still small body, placing oils on their forehead, chanting with growing urgency. And when the child did not survive, their body would have been wrapped, carried out and placed among the thousands. For the healer, the effort became a lesson. For the child, it became the end of a story too short for comprehension. Yet even this possibility does not offer a simple explanation. Children do not need to be part of experiments to become victims of tragedy. In famine, they weaken first. In plague, they burn with fever. In violence, they are the ones least able to flee. In hardship, they follow their mothers, who often collapse beside them. And here, standing among them, you feel the sorrow of every scenario at once. The air grows thick with the sense of futures that never unfolded. Laughter never heard again. Footsteps that never echoed through courtyards. Names that were never carved into stone. There is no way to tell their stories without acknowledging the tenderness that remains woven through their final moments. Even in catastrophe, someone wrapped them. Someone lifted them. Someone whispered a last prayer, even if the words were rushed. In some wrappings, you see careful layering, slow and deliberate. In others, you see speed born of necessity, but in both you sense the presence of hands doing what they could with the time and strength they had left. You feel a deep human ache rise within you, a desire to separate these children from the overwhelming mass, to imagine their lives in colour rather than in dust, to rescue their identities from the anonymity of this place. But the necropolis does not allow that. It was never designed to hold personal stories, it was designed to hold numbers. And that is the hardest truth of all. A child is not built to become a statistic. But here they did, one by one, layer by layer. In batches, in groups, in long silent rows. You swallow gently, letting the sorrow settle rather than resisting it. This module is not meant to shock. It is meant to honour. These children are not evidence. They are not hypotheses. They are not part of a theory. They are lives interrupted without warning. Their presence invites empathy, not analysis. And in the Serene myth spirit, the story you tell is not about what their bodies reveal, but about what their presence evokes in the quiet corners of your heart. Did they die from sickness, hunger, neglect, or were they simply swept into the gravity of a disaster too immense to navigate? The necropolis gives no answer. Only stillness, only linen, only the shape of lives not long enough to leave footprints behind. As you rise and step away, the final feeling lingers softly, almost like a whisper. We do not look at these children as artifacts or clues. We look at them as souls who did not get to finish their stories. And in that recognition, the desert becomes a little quieter, as if bowing its head in memory of those who never had the chance to grow into the fullness of who they could have been. There is a moment after walking through the silent corridors of the million mummy necropolis when a thought surfaces with unsettling clarity. If this truly was the aftermath of a forgotten catastrophe, if a plague, famine, or some vast cascade of suffering once swept across Egypt, then someone somewhere made the choice to erase it. That silence in the historical record is not an accident, it is an act. And when an entire civilization chooses to bury a memory this enormous, the question that rises is not simply why, but whom were they trying to protect? The rulers, the gods themselves. You let this question rest in the air for a moment, the way one lets dust settle after taking a step in a sunlit room. Ancient Egypt was a world built on the belief that Harmony Mart was the fabric of existence. Everything from the flooding of the Nile to the heartbeat of a newborn child was part of a cosmic order maintained by the gods and safeguarded by the pharaoh. Now imagine what it would mean for that worldview if tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, were struck down by sickness faster than rituals could keep up. The idea alone would shake the core of their cosmology. If the gods could not protect the people, what did that say about the world, about the king, about the priests who mediated between heaven and earth? And suddenly the first possibility takes shape. Perhaps they were trying to protect the gods. In a world where divine figures held absolute authority, admitting that those gods had faltered even once would be like tearing a hole in the sky. The priesthood relied on the belief that rituals kept chaos at bay. A mass catastrophe would appear as cosmic failure. So the silence could have been an attempt to preserve faith, to shield the people from doubt, to maintain the delicate structure of meaning that held society together. If belief was the glue of the kingdom, then the memory of divine failure would have been too corrosive to record. But another possibility rises just as softly and just as heavy. Perhaps they were trying to protect themselves. Imagine being a royal physician whose rituals, remedies, and invocations suddenly collapse before an enemy too small to see. Imagine healers renowned for their mastery confronted by an illness that ignores every prayer, every herb, every incision. In moments like that, professionals even today fear not only failure but blame, and for ancient healers whose authority rested on divine sanction, acknowledging helplessness would have been catastrophic. It might have exposed the limits of their craft. It might have threatened the very foundation of temple medicine. It might have destabilized the fragile hierarchy that depended on the idea that healers backed by gods understood the human body. So the Juibeng. This may have been an act of self-preservation. By erasing the memory of the catastrophe, they preserved the illusion of competence, of control, of knowledge that never faltered even when it did. But the deepest, most universal possibility emerges only when you sit with the thought a bit longer. Perhaps they were trying to protect the people, not from truth but from chaos. A society devastated by mass death does not need another wound. And if the memory of the disaster risked plunging survivors into paranoia, despair, or rejection of the spiritual order that held their world together, then silence might have been an attempt to save them, to rebuild stability, to pretend for the sake of healing that the universe had not unraveled. Because once people lose trust in the order of things, grief turns into rebellion, fear turns into collapse, and so perhaps the erasure was chosen to preserve what remained of the collective psyche. Yet beneath all these possibilities lies one more question whispered rather than spoken. What if they erased the past because believing the world was stable again mattered more than knowing why it had broken? You feel a strange ache in your chest as you realize how familiar this logic is. We like to imagine ourselves more transparent, more rational, more honest than ancient civilizations, but history tells a different story. Again and again, governments have downplayed epidemics, concealed medical failures, classified laboratory mistakes. Hospitals have buried scandals. Institutions have rewritten reports. The tools have changed, the clothing has changed, the language has changed, but the impulse is the same. When truth becomes too destabilizing, it is hidden. When failure threatens order, it is softened. And when suffering grows too large for comfort, it becomes statistics instead of stories. You think of outbreaks minimized in official statements, of research accidents smoothed over, of trial results quietly archived, of communities whose losses never made it to headlines. And suddenly the silence of ancient Egypt feels less like an archaeological mystery and more like a human instinct that spans millennia. People even in modern times protect myths of stability because chaos is too heavy to hold. As you walk back toward the desert light, the last thought arrives with a calm but persistent weight. Maybe the Egyptians weren't protecting gods or healers or rulers. Maybe they were protecting the fragile belief that the universe makes sense. Because once that belief shatters, once people see that devastation can arrive without warning, without justice, without remedy, the ground beneath every ritual and every prayer begins to crumble. The final emotion that settles over you is not surprise, it is recognition. History repeats itself. Only the instruments change, only the names change, only the costumes and the tools evolve, but the instinct to hide what terrifies us remains achingly human. And in that realization, the sands of Egypt feel closer to the world we live in now than we would ever expect. There is a silence that follows every long journey into the past. It does not feel empty. It feels full of the echoes we have absorbed, the lives we have brushed against, the questions that now linger inside us like faint embers. As you step back from the chambers of ancient Egypt, away from the 1,000-year-old incisions, the mass burials, the quiet stories folded into linen, a softer thought begins to rise, one that is not about them but about us, about the world we inhabit now, the world we insist is modern, rational, advanced. A world of glowing screens, sterile hospital corridors, and machines capable of mapping the human body layer by layer. We like to believe this separates us from the past, but the more you have walked among those ancient dead, the more the distance seems to shrink. So you ask the question gently, as if asking it too loudly might break something delicate. If thousands of years from now someone were to excavate the world we leave behind, what would they see? Imagine the archaeologists of the future clearing away layers of collapsed concrete and dust. Imagine them sliding open the rusted doors of an abandoned hospital, their lights sweeping across beds lined up in perfect rows, of full poles still standing like thin ghosts. Imagine them discovering our medical waste syringes without stories masks hardened, with time-sealed containers holding residues of medicines we once trusted. Imagine them finding landfills overflowing with plastic, a material we used endlessly and carelessly, believing it would disappear simply because we wanted it to. What would they think of our medicine? Of our intentions? Of our failures? Yes. Would they see compassion in the vaccines we created? The surgeries we performed? The millions we tried to save? Or would they see confusion in the remnants of frantic responses to pandemic? In the trails of equipment discarded when the crisis moved faster than our understanding? Would they wonder why so many buildings stood empty after once being filled with life? Would they assume we were advanced? Or would they see us as struggling, fumbling through desperation the same way ancient healers did under the weight of their own catastrophes? The thought is unsettling at first, but then it softens into perspective. Because medicine has never been a perfect science. It has never been a straight path. It has always been a negotiation between what we know and what we fear, a balance between what we try to heal and what we inevitably fail to save. The Egyptians faced the same truth. Their successes were remarkable, their mistakes were unavoidable, their courage was real, and their limitations were human. So are ours. You picture the CT scans we rely on today, the surgeries guided by robotics, the medicines that target illness with precision. Then you picture the misdiagnoses, the clinical errors, the tragedies hidden in quiet hospital rooms, the experimental treatments that work wonders in one case and fail in another, the diseases we still do not fully understand, and you realize that 1,000 years from now, our own medical practices will look as incomplete and fragile as those of ancient Egypt do to us. This does not diminish what we have achieved. It reminds us that medicine is not a story of perfection. It is a story of persistence, of learning from every failure, of reaching into the unknown with trembling hands and hopeful hearts. The Egyptians did this with herbs, blades, and prayers. We do it with data machines and theories, but the core is the same. We heal because we must, because suffering urges us forward, because something in the human spirit refuses to stop trying no matter how often we confront our own limits. You walk farther from the imagined ruins of our future, and the feeling becomes surprisingly calm. There is a peace in acknowledging that we belong to a long lineage of people who tried, sometimes succeeding brilliantly, sometimes faltering painfully. The healers of Egypt did not know the body the way we do, yet they cared for it with devotion. They opened skulls with boldness, set bones with skill, crafted remedies from plants and prayers. They saved lives, they lost lives, they learned, and so do we. Perhaps that is the message waiting quietly at the heart of this entire journey. Medicine is not the story of certainty, it is the story of striving. A continuous thread woven through millennia, linking ancient hands to modern ones, each generation doing its best with the knowledge it has, each hoping the next will understand more. The Egyptians left their mysteries carved in stone, hidden in tombs wrapped in layers of linen and secrecy. We will leave ours scattered through digital archives, medical records, scientific journals, and the ruins of buildings where breakthroughs and heartbreaks once occurred. And one day someone will stand where we once stood and ask the same questions we have asked here. They will wonder who we were, what we feared, what we believed, what we tried. They will see our triumphs and our failures just as we see those of Egypt. And perhaps they will feel the same soft ache, the same recognition that human beings across all eras have always lived in the space between knowledge and uncertainty. The desert wind in your mind's ear grows gentler, now no longer carrying sorrow or fear, but a kind of quiet acceptance. This journey into Egypt's forgotten medicine was never meant to give you answers. It was meant to give you reflection, a mirror through time. As you prepare to step out of this module, you take one last breath and let the final thoughts settle. When the future looks back at us, they will not see gods or failures. They will see people doing the best they could with the tools they had in a world they were trying desperately to understand. And in that recognition, everything becomes softer. Everything becomes human. Everything becomes connected across time. Night falls gently over Egypt, settling like a soft veil across the desert. The temple walls glow with the last traces of lamplight, their shadows stretching long across the sand. Above them, the sky opens in a quiet bloom of stars, thousands of distant fires watching over ruins that have seen more lifetimes than any one story can contain. The air is still. The world feels suspended, as if time itself has paused to listen. You stand there for a moment, breathing in the silence. No answers come. Only the warm hum of mystery, ancient, patient, and unhurried. And somehow that feels right. We were never meant to solve everything. Some truths stay buried not to frustrate us, but to remind us that wonder is a kind of wisdom too, that asking the question is already part of the journey. That curiosity, even when it circles into darkness, is its own form of reverence. You look toward the dunes, their shapes soft under moonlight, as if something beneath them inhales once, then drifts back into sleep, and you feel the gentle truth rising steady and calm. There are secrets beneath the sand not meant to be unlocked, but to remind us how small we are before time, even when we wear white coats or priestly robes. If you'd like to walk further into the quiet corners of history with me, I'll be here in the next story waiting beneath the stars.